Fastify is one of those libraries that once you start using, you're not going to want to use any other library to build your APIs. So what is Fastify? Well, Fastify is a web framework for Node.js. It's built to be performant and secure, and although these are important, I think Fastify does a brilliant job in other areas too. It's also inspired by Express and Happy. Although you'll see some Express inspiration inside of Fastify, I think it is more aligned to Happy. So why would you use Fastify? Well, it has full async await support. It has helpful and flexible TypeScript support. It has a rich and high quality ecosystem, and I do stress high quality. You're going to get a sense of what good quality software looks like when you start diving into the Fastify ecosystem. It's secure, and of course, it's fast. Just a little note for this tutorial, I'm going to be using TypeScript, ESM, and async await throughout the tutorial, but Fastify does support just normal JavaScript, CJS, and callbacks. So what are we going to be covering in this tutorial? First, we're going to go over the basics, and then we're going to go over to plugins and register. We're going to have a look at decorators. We're going to have a look at request hooks. We're going to have a quick look at validation, and then we have a little bonus at the end here. And this bonus is actually quite important for testing, and it's not just relevant for Fastify, it's going to be relevant for almost any web framework that you use. So I mentioned at the top here that Fastify has a rich and high quality ecosystem. So let's go take a look at what that looks like. So you can see all these core plugins here. You can see that Fastify comes with 53 core plugins and 202 community plugins. I can almost guarantee you that any core plugin of Fastify is going to be extremely high quality. And there's pretty much everything here that you're going to ever need to build an API. So let's get started with the basics. So the first thing we want to do is to import Fastify. So I'm going to import Fastify from Fastify. You'll notice that I've imported Fastify here with a capital F, and this is just so I can create an instance of Fastify. So I'm going to say const Fastify is equal to Fastify, and then we can execute this. If you're familiar with Express, then this is going to look very similar to that. I also see a lot of people call this app, and that's perfectly acceptable as well. I'm just going to call it Fastify, so we know that it's an instance of Fastify. So the next thing to do is to start the Fastify server. So I'm going to call fastify.listen inside an async function so I can await the start. So I'm going to say async function main. And then just down here, I'm going to execute main. Then I'm going to say await fastify.listen. And now we can pass in an object. We need to pass in our port. And I'm going to listen on port 3000. And we can also pass in our host, but our host is optional here. So I'm going to pass in 0.0.0.0. Now we do want some logging out of the box, and thankfully Fastify can do this for us. So we can say logger, and we can either say logger is true, and then we're going to get some default configuration for our logger, or we can give our logger an object here, and I'm going to say transport, and then my transport is going to target Pinot Pretty, and this just means that we're going to get a pretty logger. The documentation does recommend that we don't use Pinot Pretty inside of production. That's really important to note. So let's open up a terminal, and we can start our server. And you can see here that we get server listening on port 3000, and we didn't actually log this. The logger has done this for us. So the next thing to do is to add a route that we're going to listen to requests on. So I'm going to say fastify.get, and then I just want to listen to the index here. So I can put a slash, and now we can put an async function, and we can just return here, and I can say message, and my message is going to be hello world. So you'll notice that Fastify has tried to restart, but it's not able to restart because we're already listening on port 3000. The reason for this is because when we go to restart our server, we need to make sure we close it off. So I'm going to show you quickly how you can add some graceful shutdowns to make sure we stop the server right before we restart. So I'm going to put an array here, and I say sig int and sig term. And then I just want to iterate through this array here. And I want to say process.on. And I need to get the signal here. So process.onSignal. We need to give this a callback, and this needs to be an async function. Now we need to say await fastify.close, and then we can call process.exit, and we can exit with a status code of 0. So now when we make a change, you can see that our server will shut down gracefully and then restart. So I have this Thunder client inside of VS Code that is going to allow me to make requests inside of VS Code, and we don't have to exit. So I'm going to make a GET request here to HTTP localhost port 3000. Let's send this. You can see that we get back hello world. And then inside of our console here, you can see we also get a log. And this is going to say request complete. It's going to give us a request ID. It's going to give us a status code that we returned with and our response time here of 2 milliseconds. So if we have a look here, you can see that the first argument here is going to be the path that we're going to accept GET requests on. And then we have an async callback here. There is another way to define a route in Fastify, which I think is a little bit more common. And that is to provide an object as the second argument. And then we can provide our handler. And our handler here is going to be our async function. And from here, we can return an object of message hello world. Let's save this, send this request again, and you can see that it behaves in the exact same way. Inside of this function here, we're going to get 2 arguments. The first is going to be our request, and the second is going to be a reply. So we can type these with a Fastify request and a Fastify reply. Now let's say that this URL here is to create a user. So I'm going to say API/users, and I'm going to change this to a post request. So let's say that when we create a user, we want to return with a status code of 201. You can see here that we're only ever returning with a 200. So to do that, we can return reply.code, and then we can put in the status code that we want to reply with. So I'm going to say 201.send, and then we can send a message of user created. Remove that line there. Let's change this to a post request to /API/users. Send this along, and you can see that we get a 201 back, and we get a message of user created. Of course, when we're creating a user, we also want to send a request body. So let's say here we have a name. This name is going to be Tom, and we have an age of 400. To access these parameters, we can say const body is equal to request.body, and we can console.log our body, and let's just respond with whatever's in the body. Actually, we can send this, and you can see that we get our body back here. Let's say that we want to type this body now because we want full TypeScript support. At the moment, body is just unknown. So Fastify request is actually a generic, and inside of this generic, we can say body, and then we can say we expect a name. A name is going to be a string. We also accept an age, and an age is going to be a number. Now, if we hover over body, you can see that it is a name and an age. So let's move on to registering a plugin. Now, there's lots of different plugins that we could write for Fastify, but the most common sort of plugin that you're going to be writing is a grouping for your routes. So let's say that we wanted to have all of our routes for users inside of a different routes plugin. So we can say async function user routes. And the fact that this is an async function here is important. I'm going to show you what it does if we don't declare an async function. But now we can move this route here inside of our plugin. We can give this plugin a new instance of Fastify. So I can say Fastify, and I can type this as a Fastify instance. Now I'm going to want to remove this string here, and I'm going to just change this back to a slash, although we will still be able to access this URL on /API/users. So now let's go register this plugin. So I'm going to say fastify.register, and I want to register my user routes. Now I want to give this some configuration here, and I'm going to say prefix, and my prefix is going to be /API/users. Now all of the routes inside of this plugin, are going to be accessible with the prefix of /API/users. And you can see how this is really useful in grouping your routes by resource. Okay, so let's try this out. And you can see that we still get the same behavior here. We get our body logged out, and we also get our body in the response here. Your routes are not the only type of plugin that you're going to want to register. You can see if we come back here, we have all of these different types of plugins that we can register here. So I'm going to show you how to connect to MongoDB with the Fastify Mongo plugin. So we can import Mongo from @fastify/MongoDB. And let's just rename this Fastify Mongo. Now we can come down here and we can say fastify.register. And I want to register my Fastify Mongo. And we can give this some options here. I can say URL. And then I can give this a URL here. So this would connect to our Mongo instance, but you might want to create your own plugin here so you can do some logging around this. So let's say function db connector. And this needs to be an async function. Inside of here, we're going to get an instance of Fastify. You may be wondering, why do we need to define Fastify here? Because we have Fastify declared at the top here. And so obviously this function here is going to have access to Fastify, but I'm doing this all in one file where you're going to want to split this up into different files. And in that case, you need to pass Fastify in as an argument. And when you register a plugin, you are going to pass the Fastify instance in as an argument to that plugin. So now we can say fastify.register. In fact, we can move this code up. So now when we connect to our database, we can log that out. So I can say fastify.logger.info, and we can say connected to database. So the next thing to do is to use our plugin here. So I can say fastify.register. Now I can register my DB connector. And you can see here we got connected to database. Inside of our user route, let's also log down the bottom here, fastify.log.info. And I'm just going to say user routes registered. Log that. And you can see here that we got connected to database and we got our user routes registered. This is important because you can see the order in which we're calling these. We're going to connect to our database first, and then register is going to be down the bottom here. Fastify is going to honor the order in which you called your plugins here. So let's move our register user above our DB connector here. And you can see that we register our user routes and then we connect to our database. This is an extremely useful feature of Fastify because if you need to wait for one thing to be ready before you do another thing, then it's going to honor that order for you. This is really common because we want to make sure that we have a database connection before we start accepting requests. So you can see how easy it is to add functionality to your application with plugins. Let's go see how easy it is to add more functionality with decorators. So there's two different places you might want to decorate in your Fastify application, and that is the Fastify request and the Fastify instance. So let's first see how we might decorate the Fastify request. So why would you want to decorate the Fastify request? So a really common use case is as a request comes in, you want to decode a JWT and then attach the decoded user onto the request so you can use it throughout the request lifecycle. So a really common way to do this is to add a hook. So I can say fastify.add hook, and we can add hooks to different places. So you can see here that we can say on close, on error, on ready, on request. I want to say on pre-handler. Now I'm going to get my request and response object here. So request and reply. So I'm going to say request. This is going to be a Fastify request. I'm going to get my reply. It's going to be a Fastify reply. Now I'm just going to say request.user is equal to Bob Jones. So let's start this up. Now on 3. If we go into our index route here, we can log this out. So we can just return request.user. Remove that log there. Let's send this request here, and you can see that it is processing and says, please wait. The reason for this is because it is stuck on this handler here. So we need to make this an async function. So let's try that. And you can see that we get a 404 back straight away. And that is because our routes are prefixed. So let's remove that prefix. And we need to make this a GET request as well. So you can see that we get Bob Jones back here. Another way to do this without making an async function is to call a done function here. And you can see that this is going to do the same thing, but we're going to be using async await, so I'm going to make this an async function. So there's one big flaw with this code, and that is that we're mutating the request object here, and that means that we're going to lose some optimizations that are made with request for us. So the way to get around this is to say to Fastify, hey, mutate this object first before you apply your optimizations, and then we can change the value later. So we can do that with fastify.decorate request. Now we need to specify the property that we want to decorate the request is, and this is going to be user. And now we can pass in an empty string here. And this is going to work exactly the same, but we're not going to lose any of the optimizations that we have on request. Let's say that we want to make user an object here with a name, and the name is going to be Bob Jones. We should say that our user here is null because null is an object and that is closer to what we're going to be mutating the request.user to be. So let's save this again and you can see we get back our user with a name of Bob Jones. So there's a TypeScript error here, and the way to fix this TypeScript error is to say declare module, and we need to declare the module Fastify. And I want to say export interface Fastify request. Then I'm going to say my user is going to be an object with a name of string. Now you can see that TypeScript isn't complaining here anymore. If we go to access our user, so I can say request.user, we're going to get some TypeScript support here now too. So another place that you might want to add some functionality is to the Fastify instance. And this is just going to be functionality that you have access to anywhere you have access to Fastify. So to do this, we can say fastify.decorate. Now we need to call a name for our decorator, and mine is going to be sign JWT. Now let's give this a function. And our sign JWT function is just going to return a string that says signed JWT. Let's add another decorator here for verify JWT, and this is just going to return a user with a name of Tom. So now we can use this functionality. So I'm going to say const JWT is equal to fastify.sign JWT, and let's just return a JWT here to see what it returns. So we can see here that we get back our signed JWT. Let's say const verified is equal to fastify dot verify JWT, and we can send both of these back here. You can see our verified just has our name here. Again, Fastify is complaining, so we need to extend the Fastify instance. So we can come back down to where we declared our module, and I'm going to export an interface that extends the Fastify instance. Now we have our sign JWT. This is going to be a function that just returns a string. And we also have our verify JWT. It's going to be a function that returns an object, and the object is going to be a user. So if you go back up the top here, you can see that sign JWT returns a string, and then verified JWT is now going to return an object with a name property that is a string. So another really common thing that you'll want to do is to define lifecycle methods. And what I mean is you might want to have some functionality that fires every time that you make a request or every time you go to respond to a request. So to do that, we can say fastify.addHook. And I want this to be on request. And now we can give this a callback. Again, this needs to be an async function. And I'm just going to call fastify.log.info. And I'm just going to say got a request. Let's add another hook here. And I'm going to say on response. And in here, I'm going to say responding. And I want to get the request, but I also want to get the reply. I'm not going to use the request. I'm just going to use the reply. And I'm going to say reply.get response time. We can execute that. Now let's send this request. And I need to move this into some strings here. Let's try this. Send this request. So you can see here responding, and we get 1.7, and we get this really accurate number here. And this is going to look very similar to this response time down here. And that is because this is the time that our server took to respond to the request. If you want to measure metrics, which you should be doing for all of your requests, then you can put your metric here and you can record a response time for each request that your application receives. One thing that I need to mention about plugins and hooks and all this stuff is that they can be scoped. So let's move these two hooks here into our register user plugin. So I'm going to move these up the top here. Now down below this plugin, so outside of this plugin, let me collapse it. I'm going to say fastify.get. And this is going to be /. And here we can return a message that says hello. Now let's send this, and you can see that we get our logs here, responding and our time. Let's send this to /. Clear out my terminal. And you can see that we don't get those logs. We just get the logs from the logger. And that is because these hooks are now scoped to this user routes plugin. This is true for all plugins and decorators and hooks. So another really common thing that you'll want to do, or at least you should be doing, is adding some validation to your requests. So let's change this to a post request again, so we can accept a body. And I'm going to create a JSON schema here. So I'm going to say fastify.register. So the first thing we need to do is to register some JSON schema. So I'm going to say fastify.add schema. We need to give this an ID. I'm going to give this an ID of create user schema. The type is going to be object. This is just JSON schema. So you can look up JSON schema and you're going to get an idea of how to create any of these schemas. I'm going to say properties. This is going to be an object again. I'm going to say name. And then name is going to be a type of string. I'm also going to say required. This is going to take an array. And this is going to take an array of the properties that are going to be required. So this is just going to be name. Okay, so now we can use this schema inside of our route here. Just above our handler here, I'm going to say schema, and then I'm going to register this schema for the post request body. So I'm going to say body, and I want to call $ref. Now I want to reference this schema, and I need to add a hash on the end here. And body here need to have a lowercase b. So let's send this post request here with a body and has a name. And you can see that we get our body back here. Let's emit this name property here and send this. And you can see that we get a 400 bad request. And this is not going to hit the handler at all because our payload hasn't validated against our schema. Let's also add an age property here. You can say age is 400. We can send this request and you can see that age has made it through our schema, even though we haven't defined it. We can also define a response schema here. So I'm going to say response, and then I want to respond with a 201. So when we respond with the 201, it needs to match this schema here. So I can just define this schema inside of this object. So I can say type, and it's going to be an object. The properties it's going to have is going to be name, and then name is going to be type of string. We can also say age, and this is going to be type of number. Let's remove our age here. Send this back. And you can see that we get an empty object back, and that is because we've put the body inside of brackets there. Let's try this again. And you can see that we get our name and our age. The reason it didn't send those properties back is because we didn't define them in the response. So let's define another one here. I'm going to call this phone. I'm going to say 1, 2, 3. Send this, and you can see that this does not exist in the response here. So if you don't define a property inside of your response schema here, it's never going to be sent back out to the client. And this is a really handy feature. So the last little thing that I wanted to show you here is the splitting of the creation of your server and then the starting of your server. So this is going to make it really easy to test your application. And I'm going to show you just how easy it is to test your application if you do it this way with Fastify Inject. So I'm going to have an async function here. And this is going to be called build server. Inside of here, I'm just going to need to import Fastify. So inside of this function, I'm going to say const Fastify is equal to Fastify. Now we can give this a logger. And then this function should return our instance of Fastify. Okay, so let's also register a route here. So I'm going to say fastify.get, and then this is just going to return a string that says welcome. Okay, so this build here is now going to be used to create an instance of our Fastify server. And we can use this build function in our tests as well. So down here, I can say function main. Now I want to say const Fastify is equal to build server. Now we can call our fastify.listen. And we can pass in our object. I'm going to say port is port 3000. And of course, main needs to be an async function. And we also need to call a wait here because we're using a promise. The reason that I made an async function here is because you're going to want to register all sorts of plugins and everything. In this instance, this does not need to be an async function, and so we can remove this just for simplicity's sake. So now when we want to start the server, we can call main, but we can also make a test as well. So I can say function test, and I want to execute test. Now I can say const server is equal to build server, and this is going to build the server with all of our routes and plugins registered. Now I can say const response is going to be equal to await. This, of course, needs to be an async function. Server.inject, because remember, server is just an instance of Fastify. Now the method that we want to inject is going to be get. And then the URL is just going to be our index route. Now we can say console.log. And we can log out the status. So this is going to be response.status code. And if we had a body, we could console.log our body. And this would just be response.body. So let's run this, yarn bonus. And you can see that we get a status code of 200 and a body of welcome. So you can see how easy it is to now test our application. If we did our creation of the server and our starting of the server all in one file, it would be really difficult because we would have to start up the server and then we would have to somehow kill it at the end of our test. We don't need to do that because we have this Fastify inject function here. So that is the basics of Fastify. I hope I convinced you that you should use Fastify to build your next API. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a thumbs up and let me know in the comment section below what you've used Fastify to build. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.